these companies that nearly have this revisionist history, they've been incredibly successful, and they talk about the secrets of their success as though everything was just a well-oiled machine. And actually at Google, we had a strong internal culture of memes. And one of the memes that was very popular thematically was sort of a two-panel image. It was like Google from the outside. It was a beautiful futuristic city and a rocket ship. And then Google from the inside, which was like just a bunch of clowns like hitting each other over the head with baseball bats. And it's like, yes, that difference between perception and reality, even at a healthy, successful company, which I'm not sure Google is right now, but definitely at the time, overall, it was. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode. In-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm John Cutler.
I'm ridiculously excited to introduce today's guest to you all. John Cutler is somebody whose thinking I've deeply admired for some time, and I've been respectfully hounding him until he agreed to come on the Startup Podcast. John holds something of a unique place within the world of product management. Where other thought leaders and influencers preach neat frameworks and one-size-fits-all prescriptions, John explicitly embraces the mess of building valuable products in the real world. This is reflected in the name of his long-running newsletter, The Beautiful Mess. John is also a prolific poster of wisdom on LinkedIn, and his content always challenges my thinking in ways that help me grow. John, your career has followed a fascinating arc. After a series of product manager roles, you landed in the somewhat unique role of product evangelist at Amplitude, and now you're in an equally fascinating role as senior director responsible for product enablement at Toast. And I'd love to learn a bit more about that. So, John, welcome to the Startup Podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
We often like to jump straight into the topics, but I think your career arc has been interesting enough and influential enough that I'd love to learn a little bit about your story and your journey through your career, and especially your last two roles at Amplitude and Toast, and how that helped you develop your current point of view.
My career, I guess, started in my early 20s. I had a startup, a video game business, or tried to make a video game about bartending. That was my big thing. I was going to try to make a bartending game. And that didn't work out. And I was playing music at the time and touring around the United States, which is a lot of fun. And that happened for a lot of my 20s. But I would get these odd tech jobs and sort of built up chops as I was doing that. And then I sort of slipped into these product management roles over time. At least in New York, many of the roles weren't called explicitly product manager roles, but they were actually product manager roles. Then I look back at it. And then in around 2015, I really did hit this stride with a series of B2B SaaS companies. So at Zendesk and Appfolio. And then, there's one day and someone from this company, Amplitude, called, Sandhya called, and she said, well, there's this product evangelist role. You seem to like writing. You seem to like communicating about this stuff. And I really did slip into this almost like perfect fit role that I didn't even know existed before. I love talking about this stuff and thinking in public, basically. And I got to do that and make money doing it for 4 years, doing it to the point where I was actually a little sick of it at that particular point. But in my current role, I'm sort of turning that in-house into a particular company. It's called Toast. That's where I work now. But basically, I'm doing the same thing, helping teams be more effective, more successful. I don't mind those frameworks that you talked about. So teaching these different frameworks that I think can be helpful. Yeah, so it's been a funny path, where I was a dedicated product manager. That's what I wanted to do. And then I slipped in, I guess you could call it education or enablement or evangelism for particular things, but I really enjoy it. Whether it's at Amplitude where it was externally facing, helping hundreds of companies, or whether it's internal facing at a company, it seems to be something I enjoy doing. So yeah, that's the path.
So one thing that I heard you talk about, this product evangelist role in particular, that I think is interesting is just the sheer exposure to the number of different companies and product cultures and so on that exist. And I'm curious to what extent just seeing hundreds, maybe thousands of different companies and the context in which they operate has helped inform how you think about this stuff.
well informed, but also made my head explode. I think realistically, people say you go so deep with your writing and why are you doing that? And it's a lot of it's just when you see all these companies, it challenges you every day. You have these hypotheses for why things work the way they do. And you feel like you can peg companies and put them in buckets, tier 1, tier 2, there's a lot of talk about putting companies in buckets. The more companies that I started to meet with, the more I did definitely see patterns, but also you start to notice how unique the different cultures of the company are. If you layer in the culture of the founders and then the space that a company is in and its arc in its particular stage, and then the macro elements of the economy and what things are going on. And it just creates so many interesting, unique variations. I've spoken about this before, but I'm known for calling out anti-patterns. People are like, how did you know you were working in my company? Are you listening in on my meetings? I joked with a CEO that I worked with of that song, the Carly Simon song, like, you probably think this song is about you. And I was like, I'm sorry. I wish the dysfunctions were so unique to our situation, but they aren't. So you sort of notice that balance between all the unique variation on a company by company level, and then the patterns that you could call out. So that was a big part of the role. It was interesting. I'd be happy to dig into any of the particular patterns, but there's the sort of patterns of patterns, which is kind of my thing. I like patterns of patterns.
We will definitely try to dig into that a little bit, but I think this is a good segue to, I know you've mentioned this a few times, so it resonated with me, it must resonate with you, the reverse Anna Karenina principle. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that applies?
Well, it was actually this guy, Joshua Arnold, first mentioned it in a post, and then I started talking about it a lot. So credit to him. But, he was this idea that Anna Karenina, it's a little bit like all dysfunctional families are different and all the healthy families are the same. And you can imagine that being a kid, like if you're in a weirdo family, you kind of look at the families that all have it figured out and you're like, oh, my family is so messed up. But those normal families, they all have the white picket fence or they do whatever. And so in this, it flips it around, which is basically say that all the healthy, the successful companies, you could take a handful of 8 companies that everyone knows and admires and idolizes, and they're actually very, very different for the reasons why they're different. And we could take 10 companies that are struggling and then pretty much be able to identify the common things. So the dysfunctional families have all the similar things, and it's the ones that are doing well often have very weird reasons why they continue to be successful, and luck as well. So yeah, that always resonated with me when Josh said it, and it was reinforced the more companies I started chatting with. I also noticed too that I used to pride myself on detecting the anti-patterns. Like, oh, you're so good at understanding these patterns of when companies are messed up. But it was very humbling the more companies I chatted with. Like, no. The challenge is try to figure out why it's so weird that these 5 companies are all successful, but they're all very different. I'm still obsessed with that problem, basically.
It's really interesting. And like I said, the reverse Anna Karenina principle, it really resonated with me. And one of the reasons it resonated with me, and also, I guess, challenged me, is because I think I've been guilty of that, this idea that there is a right way to do product, a right way to run a company. And I think one of the reasons you and I had connected was because there are these books, right? There are leadership books, well-intentioned books, full of actually, in a lot of ways, quite good advice. But by definition, if you are showing patterns, there's an assumption that there's only, this is the way. And that's the Anna Karenina. It's like, if you want to have a happy family, these are the things you should do. You should buy your partner flowers and appreciate them and so on. But we flip that on its head, then the sort of advice that people need to be getting is less, I think, tell me if you agree, is less about patterns and more, you've already mentioned, about anti-patterns. If all dysfunctional teams are the same, what are the ways in which they are the same? What are those key anti-patterns?
Yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of business books are just based on truisms. Like, think about 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Like, I like Patrick Lencioni. I think that that's a good book and people could read that. Think of how in different companies, this idea of maybe accountability is expressed, or even something as similar as like how trust evolves. So it's so easy to say a common pattern with teams that are successful is they trust each other. But that doesn't talk about how that trust emerged. There are environments where people literally shout at each other and they still trust each other. And it can be cultural. I have a friend working for a company not based in the United States, and he's like, people don't suffer fools lightly at this company. I mean, it's like the cold eye of Sauron when you're doing something wrong, but we all trust each other. We all have a great time. But if you were in a different culture and you behaved like that, that would never go over well to do those things. So I think that that's funny, is like, it's easy to point at things like, well, you should trust each other. I fall into this trap all the time with advice that I give, like, you should trust each other. There's accountability, or you should have high agency for the people you work with, or any of these things. And ultimately it's like, yes, but how did you generate those things? And a particular example would be here in Santa Barbara, where I work. It's a pretty laid back town, but there's a university here, UCSB, that attracts a lot of researchers and smart people, and they have a computer science department. There have been a number of tech companies that have merged in Santa Barbara. I think the Mars rover was developed here, and there's a handful of successful SaaS companies in Santa Barbara. When we do our retros at the company work here, we would go out to the beach. Like we would walk around. It's all very laid back. At that company, before we went public, no one even talked about whether we made the quarter or not. It was just going. It was just working. And when I described that to someone else, they said, well, that could never work. There was no sense of urgency there. I mean, how can you? And I was like, well, in that culture, you had really smart people who happen to live in a place which is really beautiful. People are pretty relaxed and things can work in that environment. So I don't know if that, that's an example, an extreme example there of maybe how those things clash.
Seems to me that the methodologies by which a company gets to the outcome matters a lot less than the outcome of having certain personality traits almost of the company.
Yeah.
Clear prioritization, accountability, real decisions getting made instead of a lot of hedging. But the how they get there, whether they build trust through radical honesty and candor and yelling at each other, or through long walks on the beach, or through thoroughly documented multi-page memos, as long as they get there and there is a clear, repeatable, well-known way that they build trust and accountability, that's the most important thing. At least in my work, I feel like the anti-patterns are really easy to spot almost within a few moments. And I've also had the actual interaction where I've had founders say to me, hey, how do you know what's going on in our company? Like, I know you know XYZ at our company. Are they feeding you information? And I'm like, no, I wasn't talking about you guys at all. And so, it's a very interesting phenomenon because these patterns, I think while every company is special and different and has its own circumstances, many of these anti-patterns are just so common and fundamental and easy to relate to.
There's an example, it's a military example, but it's kind of interesting in the sense that, they were trying to find out how some soldiers knew that there was an improvised explosive device, because that was a major problem, let's say for the United States. And so what they learned is that they wondered how some people just had a spidey sense for what was going on, but they unpacked it really carefully. And they found out, for example, they were picking up on clues, like there's a little handkerchief wrapped around a fence, or there's certain types of settings that would be better to put an IED, or they were doing these types of things. And I kind of think that with companies I think this is where the operators sometimes, and then their venture capital, if they have investors, different people have different sample size of different samples. So for example, a lot of VCs have a lot of people in there who've met with 100 founders or 1,000 founders or whatever, and they're very good at predicting the little handkerchiefs against the wall. A lot of consultants, for example, people badmouth consultants sometimes, but they have an N of 1,000 people working up and down orgs, understanding those dynamics, but maybe not as much with the CEO. It's not like they sit with the CEO the whole time. They're not like a leadership coach or whatever. And so I think the idea that people have different ends, like just general sizes, but you have people who are amazing operators of startups who run their startups the exact same way, 3 startups, all maybe reasonably successful, who believe the only way to do things in the world is exactly how they ran their startup. And you have to remind them, it's not like you aren't a genius and really good at what you do. You just haven't seen the other people yet while you're working. So
I'm reminded of Jeff Bezos recently said, I think on the Lex Fridman podcast, his belief is that everybody is smart. They're just smart in different ways. And you've got to find people smart, right? So some people are inherently smart at certain things, whether it's using their hands or building things or thinking through things. It also reminds me of something we've been talking about on the podcast on and off throughout the show, which is this question of intuition and taste. And there's almost like Yaniv and I have this kind of subtle difference of opinion, I think, about are you born with it or maybe it's something you learn? And the answer, I think, is often the case is it's both. But it is this N of 1,000, N of whatever, where you may not know on a conscious level why, but you've developed a sense of intuition and taste about what is going wrong or what looks good on a UI or what's a good thin slice for a product on a product roadmap. And I was going to say that can't be taught, but it can't be faked. You either have talent on that or you've got an N of 1,000 and you've triangulated that on some subconscious level, but you need people on your team who have that unfair advantage.
Yeah, or benefit from not having it. I mean, I think that realistically, a lot of startups would never start if someone was actually knew what was going to happen 99% of the time. Like if they could predict that they'd be sitting there like in a pool of their own sweat and tears 5 years later with people asking them for money and asking them why they've changed the comp structure and things like that, they'd never do it. And so, sometimes we benefit from what we don't know. The same thing with frameworks, actually. It's funny. I actually think that people enjoy the beginner's mind. Like when I'm sitting there, I have to admit that sometimes when I come up with a framework for someone, I just do it for fun because I know someone has already done it. Like it's almost like don't peek. It's better for me to just try to derive it from first principles than it is to peek and figure out all the work that tends to happen. So I think what you see on LinkedIn a lot is either people steal other people's frameworks or they don't steal it, they just reference it, or they just make it up themselves on the spot because they're just too lazy at that point to go and figure out the other 55 different frameworks for it. So of course you end up with these thousands of frameworks that the next time I see someone say, who, what, when, and why, and how in an image, I just block that stuff out so routinely on LinkedIn because I just can't process it. But then again, the end is I'm kind of a student of this stuff. Maybe for other people, it's a really good, helpful source of information.
It's interesting, right? Like, I think this is sort of the thing that we've been talking about, and it can become a little bit of a cargo cult in a sense, right? Where it's like, oh, okay, this was Michael Jordan's morning routine. So if you follow his morning routine, you'll become the world's greatest basketballer. And it's like, no, that was his morning routine. So there's a couple of things happening there, right? One is survivorship bias, which is just, it so happens that Michael Jordan is an amazing basketballer and that's his morning routine. It's just a correlation, not causative. And then the other thing is it works for him because of his unique physiology and psychology. It doesn't mean it will work for you. And I think that's sort of what you're getting at. And I know you're a frameworks guy, but I think you're very different in terms of how you approach these frameworks, right? Because I think what you see is this cargo cult mentality. And when I said that your thinking challenges me in a positive way, it kind of makes me a bit anxious because I think I've fallen for this, and both as a practitioner and as an advisor, which is like, I remember years ago, I talked to a company and they're like, we've adopted the Spotify model. And I'm like, what is the Spotify model? And they're like, oh, we've got squads and tribes and guilds and shit. And you mentioned first principles. They didn't understand what made the Spotify model work for Spotify. And then, of course, it came out later that even Spotify wasn't using the Spotify model as they published it.
This is going to sound like a detailed critique, but it's pretty funny if you think about it. So if someone's not from Silicon Valley, maybe I'm talking about like a writer from Europe that they've never heard about. I'll hear from a founder in Silicon Valley say, oh, I've never heard of that person, never heard of them, so I'm not going to pay attention. I'd prefer to derive things from first principles. However, then the very next day, they're like, oh, I talked to someone on my board and that person, they had this win, everyone knows about this win. And they said we should do this, so we're going to do it. And I was kind of like, our application of first principles is very, very selective as humans, right? Like we will be like, oh, I prefer to do everything from first principles, except Andrew Huberman, I'm going to copy exactly what he says I should do every single morning because my perception is that he's figured it out a lot better.
Stare at the sun.
Yeah, like I'm going to stare at the sun and do this thing. So I think it's interesting how, especially in the Valley, there's so much blind acceptance of certain truisms. If Andy Grove said it and then 5 other companies did it and then therefore another 70 companies did it, therefore it must be the exact way to do it. I've actually found when I was at Amplitude that some of the most narrow-minded companies are in the Valley. And, I always remember like I was in Australia at some point, or I was talking to a company in Australia that's like a plumbing supply company. And they were just so open-minded and so like embracing different ideas. And no one was walking to the meeting like, well, I did it this way at Yahoo for 15 years, so therefore we're going to do it. Not that Yahoo would be a shining example, but people do that in the Valley all the time. It's like, you get this stuff. So I think it's kind of funny, what success does and like what different communities. And I would imagine it's both a hindrance and a curse for people who operate startups outside of the Valley. Both it's good because it's liberating that you're not caught in this cargo cult of the Valley, but it's also like there's obviously advantages for being in that environment with those people around. So
it strikes me that these are the two conflicting, almost foundational character traits of Silicon Valley, right? Which is on one hand, they're optimizers looking for repeating patterns, looking for best practices, looking to optimize their health, their psychology, their pharmacology. And on the other hand, they pride themselves on thinking about first principles and rethinking the status quo. And so these are the two religions of Silicon Valley, right? And they come into conflict with each other very often. And so Silicon Valley has its own kind of dogma, part of which is to ignore dogma.
Right.
Except not really, which is, I think, John's point.
That's what I'm saying is these things come into conflict because there is a Silicon Valley dogma, part of which is to ignore other people's dogma, but they love their own dogma. So
we all love our own dogma, right? But other people's dogma we don't like. Which is really
That's right. Well, it's funny because you mentioned Andy Grove, John, and I nearly think of it as a cautionary tale now around OKRs. I feel like this is, if I look back, one of the things I've evolved my opinion on the most is OKRs. And you kind of see very much much, again, this cargo cult mentality where, right, okay, so Andy Grove did, the precursor to OKRs, MBOs, and then Google famously adopted OKRs. Obviously, Google did very well. And not only did Google do very well, they then, as part of the explanation for why they did so well, they kind of evangelized OKRs as a great way of running your company. And it's quite funny, I was at Google for around 10 years, and we were never as good at OKRs inside the company as we like to say. It was actually a bit of a mess outside of some of the core search teams who had it kind of buttoned down. And then you and I were talking about this book, Scaling People by Claire Hughes Johnson, who was first at Google and then at Stripe. It's full of a lot of really good insights. But when I read that book, I'm like, it's the Google playbook. She's applied at Stripe, she's now written a book, and it has its good and it has its bad. But I think OKRs, it's not that I dislike them. I think they're a very difficult framework. They're deceptively simple, and all the hard work goes in the area of like, how do we actually create an organization and a culture that can successfully use this framework, not the framework itself.
Yeah.
And for most companies, most organizations, it doesn't work very well. And I just see, I'm sure you saw a lot of this, right? Just people hitting their head against the wall, trying to go, it's like, OKRs, everyone says this is great. Why is it not working for us?
Realistically, a lot of people go to many companies in their life and they might catch the right wave at the right company when things were working really well. They might catch the downside. They might catch the lead up to that. They might catch various things. And this is one of the things where I literally think if you might have a career for 30 years, I was asking people for a little while, I was running like a random survey with friends and I say like, of your percentage of your career, how many of the years were the good years? Then how many years were just shit? And then how many there are you just like, it just was going and it was moving. And they would be like, well, it's been 20 years. Well, when I was there for that 1 year, it was great. And then when I was there for that 3 years, it was good. And my 6 years at Google, for the most part, where I would follow the middle category, but 2 were really good when I got to work on this project. And it was like lucky if anyone could come up with like 5 to 8 of the years were just shit hot, like working. The rest of them just fit in that middle category. And some people got really lucky that there weren't a lot of, oh, I landed in this place. I just get my 2 years in and just move on. So I think that realistically too, we don't get the sample in our own lives of these things like working out. And then we get the Instagram, like LinkedIn is the Instagram of frameworks and successes and things like that. It's a little bit like this worked for us or whatever we did. So I think any company, a great example was the pandemic. Companies that had extremely strong cultures around certain ways of working, when they went remote, I noticed this very interesting pattern where the beginning of the pandemic, you could see the companies that had such strong cultures that were challenged that they just wanted to wait it out. They're like, it's going to be a year. It's going to be 6 months. It's going to be a year. We'll be able to go back to how it was before. And then you saw companies, maybe Atlassian's an example, that were like, it's not. It's not. We have to embrace this going 1,000%, that we have to challenge who we are and what we're doing. I thought that's very interesting along what we're talking about, where it's a little bit like you can have a great company, things can be great, and the conditions change around you. And your response to it then ultimately determines, how things go. So I was reminded of that, Chris, when you were chatting about that before, about it's not even you and the company, it's just the world can change around you as well, which throws it for a loop. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like working with people is hard, right? Even in my own startups, I would have these moments where it felt like I was at the top of the roller coaster ride and it was like zero gravity. And for a moment, everything was working perfectly.
Yeah, that one thing. Yeah.
Then you're all of a sudden clients, you lose your big client, this major competitor does this thing, and it was just for a moment. And the same thing happens in your career, or even happens in these squads or these groups or these projects at companies where for a moment in your career, everything is working really, really well. And all of a sudden you hit the down over the curve, over the crest, and you're going again. And so I think this is why we're appreciating so much your pragmatism on these things, is like working with people is hard and messy. Every company, every context, every macroeconomic climate is messy. And in finding your way, navigating through that, I think the lesson, I guess, and not to preempt things, but everyone comes at it a different way, but you must come at it.
Come at it with some coherent, coherent idea. And I think that's one thing I've stuck with is people say all companies are dysfunctional, whatever. And I'm like, no, well, that's probably not. It's a spectrum, obviously. But really it is. It's like in our life too. I mean, we go through downtimes, but generally companies that thrive and succeed, and when we're thriving and succeeding in companies, they minimize the amount of systemic chronic issues. There's acute stressors that happen all the time. You have bad months, whatever. Things can take 6 months to work out or 12 months, but generally the companies that work out, they have a good immune system, right? And generally the chronic things, they're kept at a minimum. There's always some level of chronic elephants in the room. And there's always acute stressors like the economy and things like that. And I think that's the one thing people need to keep in mind in their startups or wherever is if you've worked long enough, you know how sometimes they overreact about a problem in the moment. And then either, let's say you leave the company, then you talk to your old friends at the company and they're like, you know what? You kind of left a little early. Yeah, that VP of sales was a jerk. And you know what? The next one was. But then we found our groove and things worked out. So sometimes we act too fast, not imagining, like just time cures many wounds when a company is reasonably healthy and coherent and has its thing going on. And so I think that with that in mind too, you are sort of like surfing the ups and downs of your companies. And I think ultimately, if you're creating a company, you need to think, especially if you want it to last, how can I make the good outweigh the bad? And then how can I make sure to minimize the amount of chronic issues that we have over time and then embrace the quirkiness of the culture that you're in?
You'd almost wish that like HR or people and culture would have some ongoing process for identifying these chronic issues, surfacing them and addressing them, right? Like it tends to be just much more mechanistic than that, like, dealing with complaints. I know I was working at a startup where there was a lot of pain and suffering and a lot of productivity loss. And I just instituted this thing of like, I want to get everybody to write down everything that is slowing them down and pissing them off, and then figure out the higher order themes and then set up a process every week. We're going to stack rank these and work through every single one and just eliminate those problems from the product and engineering team. I wish like it's almost like you want some department. Every leader should be doing this for their department, but you almost want some fundamental orgs that's sitting there alongside and saying, let's do this as a continuous process of refreshing and
especially as a startup. I am of the belief that other than a handful of companies, most companies just die slowly, and everyone's going to make a lot of money as they die slowly. It's just how slowly do they die? And ultimately, it's how much they die in unexpectedly fast or quick or slow ways. So that's when investors will make money, is when you do the unexpected. Like you last 20 years instead of 10, or you last 30 years instead of 15. And so I think that people fundamentally get things mixed up between startups and big companies. Like once you hit this certain point, it is, can you stem entropy? And can you continue to do well? It's almost like a city. I always use the analogy of cities. It's like there's the wandering off into the woods. That's you're totally exploring, but you're starting to create a city. That's like a startup, just like that little city, you're starting to create. Once you've become a city and a town, it is about the vibrancy of this thing over time, and you do it. And so I think that when people have a startup, they miss, especially these founders that are very, very driven for these results and things like that. And they want all this stuff, obviously because they want to survive. But like once you're over the little survival hump, they don't invest enough time in the kind of resiliency mechanisms of that startup, because at a certain point, once you exceed the Dunbar number of 150 people, once you get to 1,500 people or more, culture is going to follow structure. There's a guy, Craig Larman, and he says, a small startup, structure follows culture. Yeah. And once you get over the curve, it's ultimately the structures of the org and the repeating. Like if Jeff Bezos hadn't been there in the early years and like that sort of way of continuous improvement, they do it and sort of embracing statistical process control and embracing these certain mindsets, you can't re-engineer that culture at lots of people. So I'm just saying that it is really important to seize that opportunity when you have a chance. But then I guess I could understand them if they're like, well, who knows if this is going to work? I'm not going to invest any time in that. But if you have an opportunity to spend time on it, it could really pay off to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to get to the nub of it. And, my brain's going 100 miles a minute listening to you speak here. I think I've got a couple of observations I'd love to run past you. So the first is, you talked about the main thing with the company is how slowly it dies. And I've just been thinking about the analogy of a company to an individual. So we're all born, we live our lives, and then we die. Yeah. And the difference is, well, first of all, can we stave off death through a healthy lifestyle, I suppose? But also, what do we actually accomplish while we live? Right. Companies do tend to die. It's true. You're not trying to create something eternal. You're trying to create something significant and meaningful and, in the context of a company, profitable, of course. And so it's really, how do you think about that? How do you stay healthy as a company? And then the other thought about being like a person that really occurred to me with a lot of these like frameworks and books and influences, you mentioned in another podcast that you did that I listened to that everyone is struggling in some sense. And you were talking about the roller coaster, Chris, and how it's like there are moments of perfection. Yeah. Same as in a good life, right? The difference between a good life and a bad life isn't that a good life every day is 10 out of 10. Right. It is, you have some 10 out of 10 days and your baseline is reasonable, but you have your struggles and your troubles and it's messy. Yeah. The other analogy I wanted to draw here is then you post your life on Instagram. And on Instagram, every day is 10 out of 10. And other people look at your life and say, my life must be shit because I'm not 10 out of 10 every day. And I actually think, LinkedIn, books, these companies that nearly have this revisionist history. They've been incredibly successful, and they talk about the secrets of their success as though everything was just a well-oiled machine. And actually, at Google, we had a strong internal culture of memes. And one of the memes that was very popular thematically was sort of a two-panel image. It was like Google from the outside. It was a beautiful futuristic city and a rocket ship. And then Google from the inside, which was like just a bunch of clowns like hitting each other over the head with baseball bats. And it's like, yes, that difference between perception and reality, even at a healthy, successful company, which I'm not sure Google is right now, but definitely at the time, overall, it was.
It's funny. That's why I hated that Brian Chesky interview with Lenny or Chesky. I hated it because it felt so revisionist. It was a little bit like we're running, hey, we're scaling, we're great. Pandemic hits, walked around with some folks from Apple on the beach, realized that all these quasi-incompetent people that I know more about than they know anything about, like I realized that we had veered. And so then I decided to shake things up. I was going to run it back how I wanted to run it. I didn't hear in that interview, realistically, the level of introspection that had to go on to be like, it was a little bit like, yeah, they told me not to micromanage, so I didn't. Granted, I did micromanage, but I stopped micromanaging, things got worse. And then I started to micromanage again and things got better. Like that's a pretty simple, and that's my lesson to you. Micromanage, but don't micromanage. Just go deep. That's how leaders are gonna do it. So I think that and I don't think that was the intent of that, but when I do hear people talk about this stuff, and also because I know, probably but I know because I talk to lots of people from lots of companies, almost anytime there's one of here's how we work post, I have this sort of little network of my moles everywhere. Someone will say, hey, John, they'll just be like, that's shit. That is so not how we work. That is a complete thing about what's going on. So when you know this and you're sort of in the matrix of the whole thing, you realize how contrived so much of it is.
So a lot of it's sort of like a victory lap, isn't it? It's like you've built a big successful company and you can say whatever you like about what caused it to be successful, and you can be quite self-congratulatory in that sense.
And everyone needs the failure moment. It's almost a Shakespearean the sense. It's like everyone has their third act, or like every movie, there's the action scene in the beginning, then they hit the point of conflict. And then about 15 minutes later, you transition into the hard part in the middle. And then you go through this thing. And then there's that awakening about exactly 72 minutes into the movie where then you pivot to the final part where you roll to the end. It's like we hit those major points. I think one thing that's also fascinating about this is I said to someone recently, like, just work is funny. I mean, if you had, I'm going to use a sports analogy, but if you had a basketball team that could score 150 points, a professional basketball team that always scores 150 points, and then a professional basketball team that scores 5 points, you would be like, something's wrong here. Like, we don't think in our mind the idea that you can have these companies with reasonably intelligent, smart people in them all competing in this thing and been in a company where it takes 5 days to ship something, another company it takes 50 or 150 or 300 days to ship something. So I think that sometimes founders and something, it's like, it hits them like, I must have vastly incompetent people, or people don't care, or something's wrong. But it's very hard for us, like in business, because in every other parts of our life, to rationalize the spread that we're talking about. Or the analogy that I've written about is you have a friend who's a carpenter, comes over and builds a table at your house and then sells the table for $1,000 and builds it in 1 or 3 hours. No one would doubt that. No one would doubt that because they're a pro. That's what they would do. Yet with teams all the time, it's like you could have crack team A, crack team B, and B team can't ship anything for a year because it's completely dysfunctional. That doesn't register in our brain. So I think it's also weird about how we think about skills, competency, the environment in the world that we're in. It's just funny. I find it funny all the time.
If we keep this comparison going between basketball teams and companies, I think that the problem is that what makes a basketball team great and what makes a player within that basketball team great is fairly deterministic in the sense that you need to score points.
And with a carpenter, like you have to build a number of tables, like you need to know your tools. You could sell your table. I'm a good carpenter because you'll buy the table for $1,000. Yeah, similar.
But the company of any scale and impact is such a complex organism that deals with so many complex people in so many complex roles in a complex ecosystem of companies and competitors. And so it's really, really hard to measure what great looks like and what functional looks like, right? And competence looks like. And maybe this is extremely prejudicial and maybe we'll cut this out. I don't think most people working in businesses are competent at all. And when you say a crack team can't figure out how to ship something, I think by definition, they're not a crack team.
We found our individualist on this podcast. So Chris is going to come in from the competency thing. I don't know. I gave you an example of a company I worked here in Santa Barbara. So we could take a new grad from the university and make them a highly productive product developer in a year or 2 or 3.
I don't think that the two of you are actually saying contradictory things, right? There's a difference between being intelligent and competent, right? competence is about the skills that you have. And I think one of the challenges is if you gain your skills at a dysfunctional organization,
Yeah.
you will be incompetent if you apply those skills,
Mm.
right? Wherever you
Mm.
apply them. And so, I
Yeah.
do think the crisis that we have, this is my perspective, to the extent that it is a crisis, why do so few teams feel like they're really effectively executing? We don't have a playbook, right? And then people try to write the playbook. And then you pull out the reverse Anna Karenina principle and say, well, the playbook is not the point. So the truth is, and maybe
Right.
it's because we're in a sense in tech, we're a pretty young industry still. I don't think
Yeah.
people know in any repeatable way, how do you create a functional organization that is thereby capable of training competence in people?
A couple thoughts with it. One, there was this, Peter Sanjay or whatever had this learning organization idea. And pretty much people are like, yeah, that sounds great. But there's just so many cool dynamics here. The number of companies that say, I'm going to leave people actually way more skilled than they started. And I believe in human capital, for lack of a very bad way to put it, and believe that they're going to up level everyone and upskill everyone. There are some companies that think like that, but there are a bunch of companies that are like, I'm going to hire someone. They're going to have the skills. Think about in the Valley. It's so funny at Google and other places, like promotion-driven development. A lot of it is we've got this project.
Been there.
We don't want any pairing. We don't want any crap like that. Have them write this huge spec. They can always go back and tweak the spec to say that it matched what they did anyway to get the promo. And they're going to do it, and they're highly competent. And in fact, let's reduce all the factors that would get in the way of conflating their competence. Let's not have them work with other people. Let's not have them do this. Let's do them right to the spec. You're very competent. And so what I think is kind of funny is a lot of tech, if you look at a lot of org design decisions, it's an attempt to isolate competency outside of the other variables, when I would argue that sometimes that's to the detriment of the product. If I was a founder of a company, I'd much rather have everyone be working together and not be able to necessarily know if everyone's perfectly competent to do it. So I think that there is this balance of, like, in factory work, you could just put someone in a machine and say they're competent. And in knowledge work, you could design a setting where true competence is teased out. But that isn't how we work a lot of the times when we're on teams. So that's the challenge I have.
Yeah, I don't think you want to organize a company to prioritize the detection of competence, but I do think you want to organize a company such that people understand what competence
Yeah.
looks like in that role.
Yeah.
And you want to hire the most competent people in those roles, but not optimize it in such a way that you can detect to the individual who is the least competent person in the equation.
Oh, just fire those people. The bottom 5%, just fire them anyway. You'll get them out anyway. Yeah, there you go.
But I do think, like, when I talk about competency, I'm not talking about are they intelligent? I'm not even talking about are they skillful? I'm talking about, do they have the right skills for that role at that moment in that group of people?
I love that.
For that company at that time. Yeah. So this is not a statement on the people writ large, or a permanent statement that should follow them around. But it's the word that we all love to use when we're hiring is fit. Do they fit? And that includes, do they respond to the leadership style of their immediate leadership and the broader leadership culture? Are they competent in that context? And are they led competently? And yeah, again, maybe this is a little bit, I don't know, arrogant or what have you, but I don't feel like there is people who meet that definition of competence most of the time in most companies. As you said, and I've said this on the show before, there are teams that ship stuff within 6 days or 6 weeks that teams cannot ship in 6 months or a year. And that's a serious and obvious and glaring difference. And it's painful to watch.
And maybe it's the point is when you're in a startup, it's so hard to hide from that. In any company of any size, once you get a couple layers deep, it is very easy to hide from that. And it's very easy, no matter how many metrics people say, we're going to use these productivity metrics, or we're going to use all these types of things. I think that where the cultural differences are is the degree to which the leader imagines that they can, one thing in the Valley, for example, is hire smart people, point them at a problem, and everything will take care of itself. Now, a great example of this is as dependencies accumulate in an organization. I don't care how smart someone is. There's a certain point of like cognitive load, brute forcing, what is it, MP complete problem or something like it, like there's a certain point where you can't bash your head against it anymore. Your options are either work around the problem, at which point you're self-selecting for people who are just willing to say, screw you, I'm just going to do whatever I want to do, or you slow down, or you do the best you can by zeroing in on something you can control. So I think that that's the thing when going back to the startup thing is there, it's very obvious. It's all in your face and you can kind of understand it at any size, maybe over 150 people or however many people. It's a much more, there's a great deck called the slime mold idea. We can share the link, and I've been obsessed by this slime mold deck, but it talks about slime molds and why they're successful. But then it makes the theory, it just explains why at a company in any size, once you start to get more hops, once you start information starts to have entropy, once you have competing goals within a company where people are trying to tie break, doesn't matter how, to your point about, it's like capability and competency are as much dictated by the environment and the org design and the architecture and the incentives and the funding as it is by our knowledge and skills. So maybe it's like capability and competency are a function of many things, including what you bring to the table. I mean, that tends to be my mental model.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal. Yeah, so John, I think I've loved this conversation. I can imagine some founders listening to this in the same way that sometimes when I read your content, I'm like, it rings so true. It's also a bit depressing because what we're saying is, yes, it's a beautiful mess. It's hard. There is no simple prescription, just as there's no simple prescription for living a good life as a person, right? But people are looking for advice. They are looking for support on how to build an effective organization. And, especially we're talking about product, not just product management, right? How to build great products that provide value in the world. So what to make of all this? If you're a founder, you haven't got a lot of experience and so on, you care about building a great product. You were going to just introduce OKRs and squads and empowered teams and so on. But now you're listening to this podcast, so you're like, maybe that's not just going to work. What do you do?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. So one that I've had a lot of, just from my personal life, I've had a lot of success with lately. There's a difference between oversimplification and just holding some things constant to make progress in a complex situation. So the analogy that I would use is that, like, let's just say global warming, or, that's an extreme example, but there's some complex thing. There's just lots of loops, and that's what reality is. Now, one way to do is to be like, you know what? This is just the quality of the people we hire. That's justing. To me, that's justing. Now, I think that my code word lately has been stop justing, start adjusting. You know what I mean? Like, the oversimplification is what leads us into a lot of traps. However, that doesn't mean we can't create enabling constraints and narrow the world down a little bit to make progress. If all we did was take in every single bit of data around us, we would never make any progress in our life. We would be paralyzed by it, right? I just think that the trap is avoiding these oversimplifications. So let's apply that to OKRs, for example. You know what? Pretty decent. Okay, someone writes a book about it. Our team could try this. Okay, I know that it can't be just OKRs. I know that it's sort of impossible for goals themselves to be the things that do it. But, goals seem pretty reasonable. I could guess from some kind of principled angle, that means that we create learning and we create progress in what we're doing. So, okay, let's give it a try. We're going to give OKRs a try. It's that difference between saying, oh, we're going to give it a try, put a time box on it. Here's what we would expect to see if it's working. Here's what to expect that we would see if it's running off track. Would this be great if this was working? Am I willing to observe it? Give it a try. And that difference between that's it, we're just using OKRs because these other companies are doing it. Now we're a grown-up company and now we're going to do it. The difference between that and hey, you know what? Might as well just simplify our world. We might as well put an enabling constraint down. We're going to get goals. We're going to reflect on our goals periodically, and we're going to get better at it over time. And guess what? It's difficult, but here's what I think we're going to get out of it. So I think that mindset could be very, very useful to founders for a lot of things. Is sense when you're getting pulled into justing, sense when you feel like you've just found that one root cause. It's just that idiot director of sales. It's just that marketing. They're just not up to snuff. If we just replace that person. And ask yourself, A, I'm probably part of the problem. So, what could I do? And then the second thing is also, what constraints can we put in place to try, whether it's goals or something like that allow us to at least reduce the world a little bit, make progress, and reflect on how we're making progress. That seems way more theoretical than it actually is. I could give a bunch of examples of how that works, but I think that general mindset is something people could take with them in solving these problems. Just sense when you're justing and then take that next step.
Yeah, it strikes me, and I am the guy arguing for talent and competency here today, but it does strike me that even this requires a level of competence in your leadership, right? Because there is this talent, there is this intuition, there is this art to balancing simplification and properly thinking about all the moving parts.
Right.
And there's this tension there. And so, again, in my own work, I find myself inventing a framework or a set of principles to help reduce the complexity and all the overwrought debate down to a few things that actually matter.
Yeah.
But at the same time, or at different companies, I find myself saying, no, you are adjusting. And there are
Yeah.
7 parts of the system all interacting to cause destructive or constructive waves. And sometimes each part needs a simplification or principles, but you can't just deal with one part. And
Right.
so
Right. That's a great way to put
it's
it.
about simplifying the parts, but not ignoring the interaction of the system. That takes a real talent, right, John?
Also knowing when to adjust. I think this is the thing too, is the skill. I love how it is a competency, right? Let's just talk about meta skills and then actual skills. If you have skills in a certain domain over and over again, you might not even be able to name what you're doing. In fact, when you describe what you're doing, you might be wrong, but you just effectively do it. You have a lot of patterns to go off of, right? So sports coach might not know all the heuristics they're picking up on or be able to write a book about it or post on LinkedIn with a framework. They just generally know what they're doing and have a better batting average at doing it. I think the thing with business is there is a meta skill. We would call it like adaptive or dynamic capability of knowing the class of problem you're dealing with. And then as a heuristic, being generally cautious about certain approaches. So what I mean by that is that when you start to see that all the lines start to feed into each other and everything seems kind of causally related and there's an environment that's moving around you and there's a bunch of things, you just know I'm working in a complex adaptive system. Like that's the system I'm working in. When you're in that system and you catch yourself doing a single linear causal chain, or you find yourself adjusting, stop. However, when you're in a system of like, I've done project management for many years and we just got to ship another house. Well, adjusting is a beautiful heuristic when you've done it before, right? Like just like get the thing. So I think that there is a sort of an adaptive capability or competency we learn over the years, and that some of the people I admire the most can't say that they're doing this, but this is what they're doing. I'm pretty sure like this is why they're really good at what they're doing.
There are sort of 2 things that go into that, right? Like one, you've talked before about like just getting your reps in, the value of
Yeah.
high quality experience, just trying things and seeing what works to sort of hone your intuition or your taste, as Chris likes to call it.
Yep.
And the other is, and you mentioned it before, is first principles thinking. And I think you've also used the phrase lead with the why, not the way. I think that's sort of like, okay, let's actually understand the environment in which we're operating. There's no substitute for really thinking deeply in a first principles way about what the problem is you're trying to solve. And then if you look at all these frameworks and so on, they're tools, right? You need to pick the right tools to solve the problem that you have in front of you. Is that right?
I think that's what we're getting at. I think the other example too is like take the first principles stuff. A lot of people say, well, first principles say that unless someone is X, they're not going to be able to do Y. And I'm like, that's not exactly, I would go down a level in terms of the principles that you're using. But I think that, yeah, that's right. This thing of, it's funny, the why versus the way. I wrote a post recently where I was like, put the way before the why. There are certain cases where trying to debate the why over and over and over and over again, like people say, your skill as a product manager is to be able to define the problem. I'm going to just draw on personal experience from a PM I've had to deal with in the last 48 hours. I've had to tell them there is no root cause here. Stop trying to define one problem about this. There's many moving parts here. Do we know more today than we knew yesterday? Yes. Okay, let's do more of what we did to know more than we did yesterday, today. And then we'll be able to use that. You know what I mean? Like people see these frameworks and they think, oh, I've been told I need to define the problem as a PM. When you've done this enough, you're like, no, you know what? Sometimes someone walking in with a solution is the number one thing that helps people understand what the problem was in the first place. So you reminded me of that. It's like the ability to flip the rules on all these rules onto the other side is probably the skill here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, John. I find so many junior product managers who have read the books and are wrapped around the axle trying to play the academic game of problem, hypothesis, test, whatever. And it's like, dude, there's no button on the screen that makes any goddamn sense for the user to progress into the flow. Like, you don't need to fucking test that. Just like add a button.
And I do this workshop that I've done a couple of weekends. I might do it again with some people. And it is the basics too of like, we call it like drivers, limiting constraints, floats, and enabling constraints. And we've talked about enabling constraints earlier today, but drivers are what are driving, limiting constraints are what are limiting range of motion, floats are your range of movement. And the reason why I did this workshop is I realized it's probably something I could teach founders if they're interested is I just observed people who are good at what they were doing. And often they couldn't verbalize it, but they were just very good at sensing the nature of the problem and reducing the drivers, reducing the limiting constraints, having areas of flexibility, and then putting enabling constraints in to make progress in what they were doing. And like great problems, like you see a founder and they're just like, What's driving us now is this, not that. That's a good pattern. Limiting constraints. Do not let that limit. I'm going to move that limiting constraint to a float. Do not think anymore about that. And then enabling constraints would be like, and we're going to time box this for a month, and we're going to have something in customers' hands in a month. So that's the combination of the ability to know what's driving, the ability to not get caught in these endless trade-off wars around limiting constraints, like to just know when there's too many constraints, and then how to buy yourself flexibility, either through agreeing to flexibility or enabling constraints are like artificial creativity boosters by limiting your range of movement. So we could talk about that later. I could link to a post, but I found this to be like a big unlock in my thinking in the last year, that like this is what a lot of really skilled people do, whether they call it out or not as they're working.
I think you need to reach for those tools. Well, you need to reach for those tools generally, but you know when you haven't used them properly.
Yeah.
I find, at least, when things are too hard. So if you've ever assembled like IKEA furniture and you're trying to screw in the Allen key, and it's like it's too hard, it's not aligned. It's not aligned with the hole, and you're actually trying to brute force something that's not working. So I often find when the problem is just a little too hard, or there are just a little too many problems where the answer isn't kind of obvious or easy to understand where you might go with that, that means you haven't got enough limiting constraints or enabling constraints or let go of certain requirements. So you have to go back a step and go, this is too hard. It's too complicated. We need to rethink some of
but
the
they went to
foundational pieces.
Stanford. They'll be able to figure it out. I'm just, so right. The flip side of that, right, is that like,
they'll brute force it.
Give them that problem that's just too hard and they'll brute force it.
Yeah.
I'd like to just challenge you a little bit, John, because some of the things you say, one could interpret them as saying you got it or you don't, right? It's like the best people just somehow know how to do this. And it's not that there isn't a strong element of truth to that. But again, for folks who are looking to level up, to improve their game, what's the actionable thing that they can do, I suppose, to get better at solving these types of problems?
Well, it's funny because back to that thing of reps and improving. So if we think that success is knowledge, practice, motivation, habits, and environment, those are going to impact your ability to learn over time. And often we think that it's just knowledge, which is why there's all the frameworks on LinkedIn. Like if you just knew the framework to use, you'd be okay. But like learning theorists are like practice is extremely important, and motivation, habits, and environment are really, really important. Yeah. So I think that ultimately it's just more disciplined practice. I was thinking about what is the value of writing, 1,000 odd posts about this stuff. It's practicing thinking about it. And then, in my operator roles or working at companies, I practice too. Frankly, usually in a company, you can't practice fast enough. In some cases, in a startup, you can, but in a lot of companies, you're not going to get everything you need out of the company you work for. So I was talking to a friend recently and they're like, I've created a practice of reading this strategy blog and then thinking about it this way. I think that's really decent, right? Or you could think about how to, in practice, you need feedback to practice. So as a founder, you're kind of thinking about this so very actionably. You could take this and say, you know what? We're going to do a decision jam every week in our startup. We need the couple people. We need the founders here, not just me. And we're just going to get a lot better at making good decisions reasonably quickly. We'll meet every Monday. And instead of like all the sort of like fire of the day, we'll just dedicate at least 30 minutes to doing the top priority decisions we need to make and or deciding that we don't need to make those decisions. And that's just an example of sort of like people who go and play poker or people do those things. Like I think that you can engage other people in practicing these particular things. I think the other important point, just as a huge caveat of everything I said, is many of this is extremely contextual. I one time made this tree of knowledge and I was like, sometimes people, it's just even doing a bit of the thing is the major win for them. And you kind of go up the stack and then other people are like, they'll do the thing, but they never question why they're doing it. The next person can do the thing and then realize that they are having to work too hard. Like Chris said, they realize they're having to work too hard, but don't know why. The next person realizes a little bit of why they're working too hard and they're doing the thing. And then the next person says like some reasonable hypothesis around how they could impact the things around why they're working too hard. And then you go up the next level. It's just a competence with anything. And then you go up the next level and it's like they're reasonably good at changing the environment that limited the reasons why they were doing it. And then at the top one, I just said, because I can't do it, certainly, is there like someone who can reliably do this in many different contexts, including highly adverse conditions. That's just what life and learning is about. Like, I think all of us are at different stages of that and all those things. So like, for example, the number of leaders in the world who could be dropped into any company. I was thinking about this about like Satya Nadella or those people. Could he have brought all of that magic to any company? Could he have gone to like Hasbro and done that? No, I mean, it's pretty contextual. He was in the company. And what did he do in the beginning? Like, they were no slouch. Like, Microsoft is not a slouch at technology. So there's a lot of assets. Like, it's one of the biggest and best companies in the whole world. And so when I think about that too, it's like knowing that that final category of things is not like it's not something we should beat ourselves up because we all suck. It's just, there might be like maybe a small cadre of people in the whole world that could walk into any boardroom, any startup, any things, and apply these leadership. I don't know. Those are the geniuses of the world. Those are like the Mozarts of leaders. And there's only there's only like 10 of them. Right. So I think that that's how I view it too. It's not so much like this stuff is out of reach. It's just more like it's a skill and competencies like we grow all the time.
I really resonate with what you were saying, where a lot of people think it's just the knowledge. They've read all the blogs, they've read all the books, they've listened to all the podcasts. In fact, if you're listening to our podcast, you're probably a ravenous
You're
podcast.
self-selecting for the nerds of this stuff, all right?
Right. You as founder listening right now are probably listening to all the podcasts, reading all the books, trying to up-level your game. And I agree with you so much, John, that you have to also add getting the reps, right? Doing and learning and
stop
iterating.
listening to this goddamn podcast. Go get your reps in.
Go do the work. But what I wanted to say about that is founders who are working on their baby, right, on their startup, they often don't have time to do all that practice. They don't want to practice by failing at their startup, right? Yeah. And so they need to cheat. And, one of the ways I cheated, actually, I wish I had done this at the beginning of my career, was I kind of jumped straight into building startups. And what I wish I had done was a little bit more working for great companies that I admired. Even they might be more messy on the inside than on the outside, but at least they're producing admirable outcomes and impact. And I did that a little too late. So one of the ways I would suggest founders can cheat is maybe not right now, since you're running a startup right now, but I think if this one doesn't work out or is a meddling outcome, consider trying to find the very best companies you can find, spending a couple of years there. Absent that, you need to surround yourself with great advisory boards, great investors, great fractional executives, and brilliant employees. And as many of those things as possible, and kind of cheat your way to learning this as quickly as
and
possible.
express for diversity for those groups of people. Because sometimes when I see people have assembled a board or advisors, they're all the same. And I think it really benefits to have someone who, there are sort of chief people officers of major companies who have such incredibly high EQ, read people so well, and have experienced every people issue that you have possible. And, originally when they get their advisors, right, it's all like these people who have in theory can advise us just on one of these things. And I always find it really interesting when someone goes outside of the norm to be like, oh yeah, and we've got this like former CPO of this company, and they're processing the situation on such a completely different level. Like, so you can also select people who have diverse experience. Like, how about a CPO of a company who's a woman, who's not like you, who also did startups a ways back and has kind of been there, done that, and has the reps? Because in choosing these advisors, sometimes they're only picking people with lots of reps in a certain area, and you're not going to get the same diversity, I think, with that, which is important.
John, as we wrap up, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm going to ask you to do something perhaps slightly ironic, given the nature of the conversation, which is if you could leave our listeners with one piece of advice.
That's fine. Yeah, we'll get there.
For how to lift their game, how to create an organization, again, that delivers valuable products as efficiently as possible, what would that be?
I think get enough sleep.
Get enough sleep.
All right, I can do more than that, Frank. No, I mean, I was trying to think like the hierarchy of needs. I mean,
it's not bad advice.
Like you got to be present and you've got to do these things. I actually, my answer is not far off from that, where building that level of self-awareness. And I feel this is a journey I'm on of understanding when you're at threat, when you're feeling threatened. And there's a great book called Getting to Yes with Yourself, which is about like getting to yes with your own, negotiating with yourself. That level, when I meet someone who, and meeting with a lot of different founders and different folks, it's like when they've done that work, and it could be just connecting with your family, or it could be the sleep, or it could be those range of things. Because ultimately you have to be open to the situation that's happening around you, and you have to be self-aware. And self-awareness, and I mean this in a big way, like for a while I was meeting a bunch of these founders, the number of ones that said, you know what, I grew up in this house where we really weren't ever, a B was never an option. It was just an A was the only option that you could get. I was rewarded for always doing this. Sometimes people recount their life experience as a series of these steps, but without really the awareness of where that would have put them in terms of their mindset and worldview and professional worldview and what they deem to be right and wrong and how they imagine people should work together. So, you'll find people who believe so strongly in a meritocracy, they don't even know that there is a world out there of people who think differently than them. And I've just noticed this level of self-awareness when people are self-aware, they kind of understand how they got to the place that they got to. They understand their triggers. They understand like how they are sometimes in a different mode in terms of communicating. That is just going to go a long way no matter what you're doing, and is going to make everything we discussed today a lot easier, because you're going to tighten the feedback loop, and you're going to your point, Chris, when you realize when things are getting hard, the difference between difficult and challenging versus like cognitively tense, that's also a self-awareness issue, right? So people who've only lived trying to bang their head against things and aren't aware of that and self-aware are going to easily just do that to problems they shouldn't do it. So I don't know, is whatever vague or opaque or whatever. I do think this is the skill that we can all work on that will unlock a lot of this stuff.
No, I think that's the most astute answer you could have given, because without self-awareness, without humbleness, without a curiosity and intention to learn, you're not going to identify the weaknesses you have. You're not going to double down on those reps. You're not going to be open to feedback from those better employees or advisors. So yeah, kind of a lifelong learning attitude.
Very good example. I have a great example for us to think about. There are some people who are so triggered when someone describes a systemic problem that they shut down, and then they go right into just bring me solutions. Like, I hate those people who do it. Now, sometimes when I talk to them, it's a little bit like, I had a family member and all they could do was just whinge about all this, like however nothing would ever get possibly fixed. And this thing was, I was just going to always go. And it frustrated me to no end. And once they built that self-awareness, they're like, oh, I'm doing that again. Like maybe I should listen to that employee who's just describing this more systemic issue and not bringing a solution. Yet you just see these people and you can see them ball up when they're in their trigger zone, and you can see that they're just not firing on all of those. They're not like truly taking in the situation. That would be an example, of what we were talking about.
I love that. Yep. Yeah, some people are triggered by taking a step back and talking about systems, and some are triggered by talking about details, and they only want to talk about the vision and the symptoms. And like, why are you so lost in the weeds? Yeah, and that's if you don't have that self-awareness that you're talking about, you will never ask the right questions of yourself. You'll never learn, adapt, and improve. And this is brilliant.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, John, that I've really admired about your thinking, that this is a perfect characterization of, is that getting back to that core, right? We have all of this messiness. We can't apply a framework at like layer 6. You have to dig down, and what's at the very core is yourself. And so I think it's a great bit of a generic but valuable advice. Work on yourself, and all of the rest of this stuff will become easier. So John, you have a lot of content out there, which is fantastic. And I hope folks listening will want to seek out more of it. So where can people find you on the internet?
I have a newsletter. You can sign up there. And I think if you reply to the newsletters, I've actually found it just goes straight to me. So it just comes from me. So you could reply back over email once you sign up there. But it's called The Beautiful Mess. We're about episode 270. So I've written 1 a week or 2 a week for the last 4 or 5 years. And then I have some old historical stuff, but that's the best place to find me. And then say hello on LinkedIn. Unfortunately, LinkedIn inbox and all that kind of sucks. But if you're trying to reach me, that's like a quasi good way to do it.
We'll include all that in the show notes, of course.
Also, having been a founder, good luck. It's really, really fun and hard.
John Cutler, thanks for being so generous with your time. Really appreciate it. It was a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is awesome.
So one of the things we learned from this episode is that there are no real shortcuts, but every bit of help you can get in avoiding mistakes so you can do the hard learning are really valuable. And Chris, you specialize in helping founders accelerate their learning process and get to the outcomes that they want. So if people want to work with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, that's right. And every company's unique, every person's unique. It's a wonderful mess, but there are pathways to accelerate the outcomes here and get to good outcomes quickly. That's part of my advisory work over at chrissaad.com/advisory, or sign up to my newsletter at chrissaad.com/newsletter. And also, don't forget, if you've listened to a few of our episodes and feel like you've been getting value, you've implicitly signed up to the Startup Podcast Pact, which asks you to please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcasting app and also on YouTube. And please spread the word on your favorite social network. It helps us grow the show and help more founders like you.
And honestly, if you've been listening for a few episodes and haven't been getting value out of it, why are you still listening to us? You idiot. But anyway.
Go get the reps in.
All right, Chris, that was fun.
All right.
Really appreciate your time, John. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, I wish I could do this all day.
Let's do it again sometime. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.